Good morning, everybody, and welcome to week 6. I can't believe we are entering our sort of halfway point for the class, and I wanted to thank you for the great work that you did last week, thinking about Everyday Use by Alice Walker. I'm still reading through your comments and sending you feedback on those, but do please revisit your grade book because I was able to listen to all of your recordings from last week's A Good Man is Hard to Find, which were really exciting and had some great insight in terms of the ways in which the misfit in particular and grandmother had were kind of foils for one another. So please go back and read through my comments from Unit 4, and I'll be getting you more comments for Unit 5 as we enter into week 6. This week I had originally planned on us reading something by Toni Morrison, but the book I'm trying to, the short story I'm trying to have access to hasn't come in yet from the library, so this week we're going to just switch around things. We're still going to be talking about point of view, but instead we're going to be looking at point of view from the perspective of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, a really fantastic and sort of stellar example of how point of view shifts our perceptions and understanding of mental health in this short story, which was written in 1892. In just a moment, I'm going to describe to you what involves point of view. And here I've kind of given you just a very brief rundown of the different options for thinking about point of view. But they become more specific, and I'll kind of give you some examples of what they look like. So point of view refers to the author's choice of a narrator for the story. At the start, the writer must decide whether to employ first-person narration using the pronoun I, or third-person narration, down here where I mentioned that they will use something like he, she, and they. Second person, referring to you, is less common, although the dramatic intimacy of second-person narrative address is often used in poetry and song lyrics, but not here. The writer's choice of a point of view to narrate stories usually falls into two major categories, and I've duplicated them here. So first-person narration, narrator apparently a participant in the story is a major character or a minor character, or third-person narration, the narrator is a non-participant in the story, but rather has either an omniscient, limited omniscient, objective perspectives, and I'll talk about those in just a minute. So first on first-person narration. The first-person narrator can move freely within the fictional world, and he or she can approach other fictional characters as closely as one human being can approach another. But the narrator has no way of understanding these characters except by observation of what they say or do. The first-person narrator, whether a major or minor character, can be reliable or unreliable, making us aware as we read his or her short story that the account is skewed and that we can't quite trust the point of view. So think about that trusting, especially in this short story. At the beginning of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, the first-person narrator, who is the major character in the story, says she is trying to regain her health after a mental breakdown. While she tells her story, an attentive reader notices that her disorientation from the so-called real world becomes much more acute. So keep that in mind as we're reading the short story, how the first-person narration shifts or can in some ways be unreliable. A little bit more about third-person narration now. So third-person narration means that the author tells the story using the pronouns he or she instead of the presumably more subjective I. An omniscient narrator is one that is aware of sort of all of the things going on. The omniscient point of view is most clearly apparent in fairy tales beginning once upon a time, when the teller knows everything that is to know about the characters, both inside and out, what they think and feel, as well as what they do. Now, limited omniscient, as you might guess then, confines the narrator to revealing the thoughts of only one character. And so that kind of limits the perspective that we understand the fuller story to play out with. It actually was created by Gustave Flaubert, who exchanged the distancing of Once Upon a Time for an interior, more subjective view of characters and events, of which F. Scott Fitzgerald's Winter Dreams is an example of the limited omniscient narration. Its narrator also sticks to impartial, which is non-judgmental. I put that here. Omniscience, telling the story without really evaluating or commenting on the actions which speak for themselves. And then finally, objective narration, which presents what appears to be a detached perspective on the characters and the plot of a story. Setting, action, and dialogue are laid out on the page without the narrator's comments or the character's reflection. When Conrad said that Maupassant, as we read earlier, the necklace, was interested in using only facts to tell his story, Conrad was implying that Maupassant was attempting objective narration, if you remember, kind of looking in on Mademoiselle Loisel. Maupassant himself insisted on his personal view as a writer and his selectivity presenting the illusion of reality. For example, Maupassant's personal view included a snobbish disdain for the social climbing wife from a modest background in the necklace, apparent in his choice of words in the first page of the story. Awareness of the point of view helps the reader become sensitive to the construct of language that is the story. Good readers understand that the way the story is written is an essential part of what it is saying. This week I'm so excited to present to you Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. A little bit about Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who was born in 1860, so we're going way back in time. She was born in Hartford, Connecticut, and her father actually deserted the family after she was born and provided her mother with only meager support. As a teenager, though, she attended Rhode Island School of Design for a brief period and worked as a commercial artist and teacher. So one of the things I want us to think about this week is the relationship between art and storytelling and sketching and the way we craft our stories, if there is some kind of connection between how we see the world and how we talk about the world. Like her great aunt, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was concerned at an early age with social injustice and wrote poetry about the hardship of women's lives. Here I've crafted on her website what I think is really interesting, a sketch from one of her notebooks. It says, "Oh mother," said the little maid, "why do I wear a skirt and underclothes so scant and white, when both my duty and delight is to play in the dirt?" So from an early age, she's kind of thinking about the role of women and the role of sort of her expectations versus what she desires to do. In 1884, she married the artist Charles Walter Stetson, but she suffered extreme depression after the birth of a daughter, so she left her husband and moved to California in 1888. Now, she wrote the short story in 1892. They were divorced, and she later met George Houghton Gilman, with whom she lived for 34 years. This best-known work in the short story that you're reading this week was written around 1890, shortly after her own nervous breakdown. A landmark story in its frank depiction of mental illness, it is part fantasy and part autobiography, an imaginative account of her suffering and treatment by the physician S. Wyer Mitchell, who forbade her any activity, especially writing, the thing she most wanted to do. In setting the story, Gilman used elements of the conventional Gothic romances that were a staple in women's popular fiction. So you'll see an isolated mansion, a distant but dominating male figure, and a mysterious household, all of which force the heroine into the role of passive victim of circumstances. But Gilman gave her own twist to the form. Using the brief paragraphs and simple sentences of popular fiction, she narrated her story in 12 artfully crafted sections with a clinical precision that avoided the trite language of typical romances. Some brief notes about what scholars have said about Gilman's writing. I wanted to share with you Elaine Showalter's section, paragraph called "From the Yellow Wallpaper," an essay written in 2009, and also one down here by Sarah Gilbert and Susan Gubar, a feminist reading of Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper. So Elaine Showalter says, on a June day in Pasadena with a thermometer at 103, Gilman wrote her most important short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. Told in a series of brief paragraphs of 1 or 2 sentences, The Yellow Wallpaper is a first-person narrative. All right, so it's already giving away our point of view. A secret journal covering 3 months from approximately June 1st to the end of August. Its author is an unnamed woman who has been taken by her physician husband John to a secluded house in the country, a colonial mansion, a hereditary estate is what this text has, direct quotation, in order to cure a nervous illness, a, quote, slight hysterical tendency, end quote. She's developed after the birth of a son. The house is isolated 3 miles from the nearest village, and on its extensive grounds there are high hedges and locked gates, and inside the house at the top a large room with barred windows, rings on the walls, and an iron bed nailed down to the floor, which is, quote, gouged and splintered, end quote, while the room's yellow wallpaper has been ripped and torn. This is the bedroom the narrator and her husband share at night, although she is alone in it during the long summer days when she secretly writes in her diary, which she isn't supposed to be doing. So she says the realistic subtext of the story is that she suffered a postpartum depression so severe that her husband and relatives are afraid she may harm herself or the baby, or both. The remote house sounds like an abandoned private mental hospital where the barred windows and nailed down bed are signs of former patients who have been incarcerated. Like the dead paper of her journal to which she confides her thoughts, the narrator also projects her suicidal feelings and violent obsessions onto the Art Nouveau wallpaper, which has a maddening pattern, a florid arabesque. And so you might want to look up those terms. There's actually a lot of terms in here that need further explanation and inquiry. And finally, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Kubar write, because Gilman knew with Emily Dickinson that infection in the sentence breeds, she knew that the cure for female despair must be spiritual as well as physical, aesthetic as well as social. What the yellow paper wallpaper shows, she knew too, is that even with a supposedly mad woman has been sentenced to imprisonment in the infected house of her own body, she may discover that, as Sylvia Plath was to put it 70 years later, she has a self to recover, a queen. I think you should be, you'll find this story very exciting. And again, one of the earliest examples of someone examining, self-examining mental health and her position as sort of a woman recovering from postpartum depression as a short story. So the collaborative reading for this week, I'd like you to click here and open up the document, read through it very carefully. Of course, this is the centerpiece of our class, always reading very carefully and closely to our short stories. And I would like you to include one comment on what point of view the passage was written in. Again, we know that it's going to be first person, but you might comment on the reliability of the narrator, on what she's saying at any given point, and what impact this point of view has on the truthfulness of the narrator. And then add a second comment of your own choosing. By Friday, please respond to just 2 comments from your peers. For terms and concepts this week, I'd like you to contribute a meditation on the Charlotte Perkins Gilman archive at Harvard University. There's this great digitized archive that I'd like you to look through that includes her drawings, notes, even clippings of hair. And I'd like you to present one artifact from her archive. Just copy and paste it into our slide deck. Include the hyperlink as well, as I've done above here, sort of the information plus the sort of artifact, and explain what you found and any information you can garner about how she captures point of view in this art. So I've actually given you an example. When you click on the archive link, you'll see down at document types, you can click on drawings. Feel free to explore more, but you'll see that this one limits you to 637 items, and you can kind of search through and see what kinds of sketches she's included and try to garner what kinds of point of view that she's included here. In the slide deck, you'll see that I've included just a brief example of what you might be including for your own entry. Point of view, I put sample student, so just please enter your own name here. And the sketch here is of a horse that appears frightened, caught off guard. If Gilbert had decided to show the majestic and beautiful side of horses, she may not have focused on the tenseness of the horse, its neck stiff and eyes alert, a perspective that makes the onlooker feel like they are trespassing, a voyeur. And does that kind of perspective in any way reflect upon like something that happens in the short story? So you can just identify how she's capturing perspective here from viewer and to looker, looking back from the paper, just thinking about how she's depicting things that we are looking at. The last bit for your projects for this week, I think you'll be excited by. You did so well with the reading aloud and also the casting of the characters. This week, I'm going to have you actually do some drawing, some illustrations, sketches. I'd like you to, after reading the short story, of course, draw your own Gilman-like image, sketch, drawing, painting that highlights a specific point of view in the story. So again, showing like maybe characters interacting or a certain like view of, a particular area in the house. And quote from the story to support, what you're showing, of course. You may decide to make this sketch with a pen and paper or by using your computer. Either is fine. Again, take your own liberties with this one. I hope you have fun. I want you to just be thinking about, as you're doing this, the point of view and how that impacts your vision of what's happening in the story. So on your Google site page titled Unit 6 Point of View, include your image, complete with a title or phrase beneath the image, and an explanation about why you made the artistic choices you have. Again, I'm not concerned about how good the sketch is itself, but I want to see that you might conceive of the link between art forms, sketching, and storytelling. Include an explanation of the choices you have made in the sketch in relationship to the short story. Please quote directly from the short story for full points. Make sure you do that because that's our sort of most important part of class. I hope you have a great week and looking forward to seeing your drawings this week.